classical references as he used it to devise an unlikely coherence between the original museum, his own interventions, and the landscape. His assistant and Annie's now partner, Rick Gooding, captured this sensibility in an elegant topographical model he inserted into the sketchbook after slicing away a thick portion of its pages. This is a good hint for students. If you're given a drawing-only competition, take away enough of the pages provided to make room for a model. A source close to the deliberations assured me that Israel was the jury's favorite, but rumors that he was stricken with HIV, he was probably also stricken by HVAC-related problems, but rumors that he was stricken with HIV gave museum administrators pause. Whether such rumors swayed Getty Trust President Harold Williams, with whom the decision ultimately rested, is impossible to say. In any event, Williams chose Machado Silvetti, which completed its renovation of the villa in 2005, with the extensive assistance of our own Andrew Cruz on the design team. Even so, Israel, the source assured me, never knew how close he came to winning the competition. Now, on the heels of that competition, he got other institutional work that I think Annie's going to talk about, so I will not, at UCLA, and this fantastic project at UC Riverside for the arts building that was completed after Israel died in 2001. And this kind of shows the sort of institutional work that was on the horizon for Frank had he survived his illness just a bit longer. Annie, I think, is also going to discuss the Draeger House in Berkeley Hills, in which she was a pivotal collaborator. I'll just show you some of these archival images, the development of the project through to its final form, some interiors. This really amazing sequence that you move up through the space that kind of moves from cellular to open as you move up through the section, and then finally resolves into this abstracted vernacular bungalow at the top of the elevation. It's a really fantastic project. But I will conclude here with the last project that Frank lived to see completed. This is the Dan House in Malibu. And like the Draeger House, the Dan House rose from the ashes of a tragic wildfire. Israel and project architect Stephen Shortridge had nearly completed designs for a renovation of Michael and Cecilia Dan's Malibu ranch house when, in November 1993, the old Topanga fire ignited high in the Santa Monica Mountains and burned all the way to the ocean, consuming their home along with 350 others. With so much design work already completed, the Dans decided to proceed with the project pretty much as designed, agreeing to rebuild much of the existing house along with Israel's modifications. For inspiration, Israel looked to the architecture of Frank Lloyd Wright and also to Airstream trailers and the red barns that dot rural California. One arrives through an angular entry into a broad living area that opens to a pool and lush gardens beyond. Here's a little bit more of that space. Bedrooms are as conducive to individual sanctuary as the common areas are to conviviality, and each features complex millwork, like this headboard, which Israel rendered as an asymmetrical accretion of millwork and impaled with a steel column to support canted ceiling beams. Elegantly crafted in lacquered Douglas fir and capped with a fan of structure above, the headboard suggests about as much calm as an afternoon nap beneath a helicopter. When I asked Cecilia Dan about this curious assemblage, she grinned slyly and quipped, "I guess Frank understood our marriage." Whatever he might have gleaned about his clients' personal lives, Israel clearly understood what it meant to build in Malibu's achingly beautiful yet unforgiving terrain. High-priced real estate gets you a view, but no protection from wind and heat, Herbert Ruchon presciently observed. Despite Malibu's cool vistas, this is desert country, where the weather conducts seasonal seminars on the return of dust to dust. The Chumash people, who inhabited this stretch of coast for millennia, understood as much and sometimes practiced intentional burning of the volatile chaparral. Spanish settlers found the terrain inhospitable and left it largely unmolested until the 19th century, though even then it remained remote and sparsely populated. The cutting of the Pacific Coast Highway through the area in the 1920s spurred runaway development, which has been reduced to ash, rebuilt, and burned again at regular intervals in the intervening century. In short, to build in Southern California requires one to come to terms with catastrophe. And most of the houses you see here burned in the last fire. The Dan house survived, but almost no houses on the street were as lucky. To build in Southern California requires one to come to terms with catastrophe. Most choose to look the other way, avoiding the issue until fire, rain, earthquake, or social upheaval rudely unsettle one's illusion of sanctuary. Some cope by concocting elaborate escape plans by private jet or yacht or limousine, to a secluded study, bath, or bunker, or into the comforting diversion of history, gossip, or the silver screen. Others make the region's violent vocabulary their own, lashing out against its frustrating indifference and senseless mercurial assaults. Gentler types commune with the landscape and learn to love its serrated edges, stubborn masses, and exotic forms. Others still wear their vulnerability on their sleeves, making of impermanence and ephemerality a mantra. Newcomers find their way by adopting indigenous customs and mores, often learn to speak the local patois with uncanny fluency, and sometimes survive by casting themselves in the role of apprentice, understudy, or protege. Sun-seared natives and a constellation of celebrities comprise a living tally of the seductive gains and withering costs of the continued belief in the California dream. In nearly 2 decades in Los Angeles, Frank Israel found success with many of these approaches in his life and in his art. With the Dan House, the last design he lived to see completed, he offered another, more personal alternative. Although aspects of previous projects are present here, his earlier characterizations, cities within, urban villages, worlds apart, fail to capture the Arcadian sense he ascribed on this secluded Malibu ridge. This becomes clear when one wanders the landscape into the valley below. Turning back to regard the house, one senses more clearly the uncanny delicacy of Israel's intervention. From this vantage point, fragmented red-orange surfaces pale in significance against their leafy surroundings. Trading the perils of permanence for the more fleeting pleasures of the provisional, the house presents not a single building, but a collection of cabins, maybe just a few tents, recently erected on a hillside clearing. Here, Israel's career comes full circle, to fashion an architecture appropriate to this beautiful, duplicitous landscape. He drew on his most cherished childhood memories. Perched high above the Pacific, the Dan House reprises his beloved Camp Tahoney, a temporary haven to be treasured while it lasts and abandoned at the first sign of apocalypse. Thank you for listening. I will turn it over to Annie.
Thank you for having me, Todd and Knowlton School, and thank you for the really, really over-the-top introduction. I've never heard an introduction that's not just straight from a bio or something. So thank you also for that kind of insightful thing. So I'll start. What I wanted to share today is actually a journey between school, people you work for, and what happens after, which I think is more interesting for students who are in the audience. I work for 2 very slow offices and graduated from SciArc as an undergraduate. During the time, there's a lot of different thoughts going on. So I have taken studio from a conceptual artist, from a classicist, I learned the orders, from an urban planner, and from a protege of Frank Gehry's office. So that gave me this kind of eclectic California experience. Use the cursor on the thing. So the slow part of it happened after undergraduate. I went to New York and I started working for Todd Williams and Billy Chan, and that's a very slow office. We chew on ideas and details for a very long time before we let it happen. And at Frank Gehry's office, I was in charge of doing iterative models. So Frank comes in, he has 10 ideas. Each 10 ideas get 10 iterations, and then he looks at it and he said, this one, this one, this one, 10 more of these. So with that kind of iterative process of model making, I think that's sort of where you were referring to. I do a lot of models back then, and really quick, dirty models. I went back to Columbia for my graduate work, and there I met a classmate who was a young faculty at University of Kentucky who sat next to me, and during the entire term he only works on one model and 2 drawings, and it was on those 3 physical things that we all looked at Kurt Schwitter's Merzbau project. We were fascinated. This is 1923 to 1937. Schwitter's built this in his Berlin studio just over time, and I was really fascinated by these continuous plastic forms. This is thesis model from Columbia. So you can begin to see I was asking questions, but I was only asking questions from the exterior relationship between landscape and architecture, and not so much understanding what's going on inside of it. And that's in contradiction to the
for Architecture and Urban Studies, and became very close friends with Philip Johnson around the same time. So Frank, from the very early part of his career, was assembling this network of kind of high-profile colleagues that could kind of help advance him along his way. He was central to the debates of the white versus gray camps in the early 1970s. He was a kind of go-between. He was one of the few that were welcome on both sides of the aisle. And he really took that influence to heart in his first building, which he designed for a counselor at Camp Tahoney in East Hampton. This was a time when camp counselors could afford to build houses in East Hampton. This house was built for $25 a square foot, for anybody who's counting. And he was off and running. Not long after the house was built, he secured a fellowship at the American Academy in Rome. Some of you may recognize this curly-haired fellow up the top of the picture. Look fast. It's Rob Libsey. Rob was in Frank's class of fellows at the Academy in the 1970s. Frank did at the time a number of projects, including this project for Audrey Hepburn, a pool house on her estate on the Appian Way, which also turned out to be a fiction. He never met Audrey Hepburn, but claimed to have this commission on the way in the 1970s. So again, this kind of fictionalization is part of the mix. After his time in Rome, he went to Tehran and worked on a master plan for the city that had been commissioned by the Shah. That project was canceled with the revolution in Iran. And by 1977, he wound up at UCLA. There's Craig Hodgetts. I've got just nothing but baby pictures in this lecture, so if you know some of these people, it's fun to see them. There's also Peter de Bretteville and Coy Howard and Bob Mangurian. But Frank, he came to LA, was invited to teach one 10-week studio, had no money. He wound up hanging around in LA, needed to make ends meet, so he got a job working in Hollywood as a set designer and special effects artist. He very quickly went on to he joined the Set Decorators Union, or Guild, I guess, and relocated to Manila very briefly to work on this god-awful movie called Night Games, which starred Ferris Bueller's mom and was directed by Roger Vadim. I did the hard work of going and finding and watching this movie, so you don't have to. He also did a lot of set decoration work. He's tried his hand at screenwriting. He had a column in GQ magazine. He had a really interesting early life in LA. He liked to party. Annie, is that Frank? That looks like Frank. The guy on the left. I know he was there around the time this picture was taken. But it kind of speaks to a sort of biography that I unpack a lot more emphatically in the book. All the while Frank is building his practice, much of his work was influenced by his friendship and mentorship with Frank Gehry, who who referred certain clients to him, like Joel Gray and Joe Wilder. And what I want you to see in this series of projects is, I'm not going to unpack them specifically, but I want you to pay attention to the kind of referentiality that Frank used in his work. So you can see here, Frank is very clearly looking at Le Corbusier's early villas of the 1920s and 30s. In this project in the Philippines, he's looking at indigenous vernacular constructions in the Philippines. Here, back in LA, he's looking at vignola. Here, he's looking at ancient Egyptian pastiche postmodernism. He had some real clients as well. This was a gigantic house he did for Andrea Rich, who was a chancellor at UCLA, and her husband John, who was the producer of Hogan's Heroes and MacGyver. And instead of building the house, they got divorced, so that one didn't happen. He renovated this house for Jules Stein, who was the head of MCA, a super important talent agency in LA. This project was canceled when the house was sold to Rupert Murdoch. So he built those connections very early, and often was asked by clients to reference the work of others. So in this loft in New York, this client specifically requested a project that looked like the work of Luis Barragan. You can see Barragan on the left, Israel on the far side, or I guess Barragan on the right. Here's the interior. And through this period, we see him riffing on the work of a lot of influences. Venturi Scott Brown in this house at Lake Arrowhead, Rob Millay Stevens in this house in the Hollywood Hills, Frank Gehry himself. That's Frank's work in the upper part of the screen, Big Frank and Little Frank, as they were called at the time. Carlos Scarpa, Rudolf Schindler, Gehry again, the Eameses, Schindler again, even himself in certain ways. And so Frank's work very often through this early period had to do with this kind of making new architecture out of overtly referential projects. Here are just some of the influences he used for propaganda films, varying from Frank Gehry to Ostia Antica to Piranesi to the client's favorite movie. And what's important to notice here is this was not just simply copycat work. Frank was really committed to kind of taking these examples and getting them to do things that they wouldn't normally do. So a lot of what I do in the book is kind of unpack the way he would kind of swerve these references in the kind of Harold Bloom meaning of swerving to produce something that was, kind of born of its influences, but turned into something new. And I think it's a really great model for students. His star began to rise very quickly with this show in Minneapolis, and then he brought on a field of collaborators, including Annie Chu. There's a baby picture of Annie over here on the left, and Barbara Callis and Stephen Shortridge, who became really important collaborators. One of the things I try to do a lot in the book is speak about the importance of the people that Frank worked with and the influence of those people on the work that he did. And so you can see, for instance, in a project that was led by Stephen Shortridge, you can see these very intricate plan arrangements where the kind of referentiality of the San Carlino swerving through in this wall, these very complicated geometries, these very lightweight planes that kind of hover overhead. That Stephen's projects have a real a kind of particularity that is contrasted by the projects that Annie led, such as the Wu House or this library at UCLA, which are very much of the ground, of the landscape, work much more in these kind of three-dimensional model-making modes. So Annie's projects always seem to start as models. Stephen's projects always seem to start as drawings. And yet Frank was kind of guiding the direction of all of these projects. So collaboration becomes a big part of it. Frank grew up with this cast of characters in Los Angeles. who I won't get into, who were doing work like this that Frank was sometimes emulating, sometimes swerving away from. And his notoriety grew very quickly. We see him very quickly, like suddenly on magazine covers at a fairly regular pace, his work getting increasing attention, his work getting better as the works are becoming more confident, more able to kind of hold their own. The development of certain strategies about folding we can see in a very tentative way here, much more elaborate. I think Annie's going to talk about this project a little bit more, so I won't. But we see the kind of vocabulary developing through these projects. And so with that background, I just want to take another, say, 5 minutes to unpack a few projects from the end of Frank's career in the prose of the book, and then I will turn it over to Annie. Israel's steady rise in notoriety through the early 1990s coincided with a period of economic uncertainty and social turmoil in his adopted home in Los Angeles. In 1990, the U.S. economy slipped into a recession that hit Southern California particularly hard and exacerbated social and political adversity that had been simmering in the region for decades. Increasingly violent gang activity, fueled by an explosion in the use of crack cocaine, sensationalized in the media, and mythologized in the gangster rap of Ice-T and NWA, burned images of Uzi-toting teens, drive-by shootings, and the color-coded streetwear of Bloods and the Crips into the popular imagination as it reflected increasingly desperate conditions in places like Compton, South Central, and Watts. The intensifying pressure between the LAPD and inner-city neighborhoods reached its boiling point in April 1992, with the eruption of citywide rioting after the acquittal of 4 officers who viciously beat a young black man, Rodney King, during a traffic stop the previous year. Tragedy struck again in 1994 with the murders of Nicole Brown Simpson and Ron Goldman in upscale Brentwood, and then devolved into tabloid media farce with the sensational arrest, televised trial, and ultimate acquittal of former football star O.J. Simpson for the crime. The early 1990s also were marked by natural disasters, some of which directly impacted Israel's practice, including the powerful Northridge earthquake of 1994 and the devastating wildfires in the Berkeley Hills and in Malibu, which alone burned more than 50,000 acres. Amid the chaos, the AIDS pandemic raged, and Israel's own illness took an increasing toll. He underwent chemotherapy at UCLA and was prescribed an evolving battery of medications. To ease his chronic back pain, he set up a cot in his Robertson Boulevard studios, from which he often gave direction to collaborators and sometimes met with his clients. Through the early 1990s, Israel was being considered for larger work, including an important competition to expand the J. Paul Getty Museum, now the Getty Villa, in 1993. Along with 5 other firms, Israel was given a blank sketchbook to fill with ideas for the project. Working with Annie as project architect and the classicist Bernie Fischer as a consultant, Israel filled classical references as he used it to devise an unlikely coherence between the original museum, his own interventions, and the landscape. His assistant and Annie's now partner, Rick Gooding, captured this sensibility in an elegant topographical model he inserted into the sketchbook after slicing away a thick portion of its pages. This is a good hint for students. If you're given a drawing-only competition, take away enough of the pages provided to make room for a model. A source close to the deliberations assured me that Israel was the jury's favorite, but rumors that he was stricken with HIV, he was probably also stricken by HVAC-related problems, but rumors that he was stricken with HIV gave museum administrators pause. Whether such rumors swayed Getty Trust President Harold Williams, with whom the decision ultimately rested, is impossible to say. In any event, Williams chose Machado Silvetti, which completed his renovation of the villa in 2005, with the extensive assistance of our own Andrew Cruz on the design team. Even so, Israel, the source assured me, never knew how close he came to winning the competition. Now, on the heels of that competition, he got other institutional work that I think Annie's going to talk about, so I will not, at UCLA, and this fantastic project at UC Riverside for the arts building that was completed after Israel died in 2001. And this kind of shows the sort of institutional work that was on the horizon for Frank had he survived his illness just a bit longer. Annie, I think, is also going to discuss the Draeger House in the Berkeley Hills, in which she was a pivotal collaborator. I'll just show you some of these archival images, the development of the project through to its final form, some interiors. This really amazing sequence that you move up through the space that kind of moves from cellular to open as you move up through the section, and then finally resolves into this abstracted vernacular bungalow at the top of the elevation. It's a really fantastic project. But I will conclude here with the last project that Frank lived to see completed. This is the Dan House in Malibu. And like the Draeger House, the Dan House rose from the ashes of a tragic wildfire. Israel and project architect Stephen Shortridge had nearly completed designs for a renovation of Michael and Cecilia Dan's Malibu ranch house when, in November 1993, the old Topanga fire ignited high in the Santa Monica Mountains and burned all the way to the ocean, consuming their home along with 350 others. With so much design work already completed, the Dans decided to proceed with the project pretty much as designed, agreeing to rebuild much of the existing house along with Israel's modifications. For inspiration, Israel looked to the architecture of Frank Lloyd Wright and also to Airstream trailers and the red barns that dot rural California. One arrives through an angular entry into a broad living area that opens to a pool and lush gardens beyond. Here's a little bit more of that space. Bedrooms are as conducive to individual sanctuary as the common areas are to conviviality, and each features complex millwork, like this headboard, which Israel rendered as an asymmetrical accretion of millwork and impaled with a steel column to support canted ceiling beams. Elegantly crafted in lacquered Douglas fir and capped with a phantom structure above, the headboard suggests about as much calm as an afternoon nap beneath a helicopter. When I asked Cecilia Dan about this curious assemblage, she grinned slyly and quipped, "I guess Frank understood our marriage." Whatever he might have gleaned about his clients' personal lives, Israel clearly understood what it meant to build in Malibu's achingly beautiful yet unforgiving terrain. High-priced real estate gets you a view, but no protection from wind and heat, Herbert Mouchon presciently observed. Despite Malibu's cool vistas, this is desert country, where the weather conducts seasonal seminars on the return of dust to dust. The Chumash people, who inhabited this stretch of coast for millennia, understood as much and sometimes practiced intentional burning of the volatile chaparral. Spanish settlers found the terrain inhospitable and left it largely unmolested until the 19th century, though even then it remained remote and sparsely populated. The cutting of the Pacific Coast Highway through the area in the 1920s spurred runaway development, which has been reduced to ash, rebuilt, and burned again at regular intervals in the intervening century. In short, to build in Southern California requires one to come to terms with catastrophe. And most of the houses you see here burned in the last fire. The Dan house survived, but almost no houses on the street were as lucky. To build in Southern California requires one to come to terms with catastrophe. Most choose to look the other way, avoiding the issue until fire, rain, earthquake, or social upheaval rudely unsettle one's illusion of sanctuary. Some cope by concocting elaborate escape plans by private jet or yacht or limousine, to a secluded study, bath, or bunker, or into the comforting diversion of history, gossip, or the silver screen. Others make the region's violent vocabulary their own, lashing out against its frustrating indifference and senseless mercurial assaults. Gentler types commune with the landscape and learn to love its serrated edges, stubborn masses, and exotic forms. Others still wear their vulnerability on their sleeves, making of impermanence and ephemerality a mantra. Newcomers find their way by adopting indigenous customs and mores, often learn to speak the local patois with uncanny fluency, and sometimes survive by casting themselves in the role of apprentice, understudy, or protege. Sun-seared natives and a constellation of celebrities comprise a living tally of the seductive gains and withering costs of the continued belief in the California dream. In nearly 2 decades in Los Angeles, Frank Israel found success with many of these approaches in his life and in his art. With the Dan House, the last design he lived to see completed, he offered another, more personal alternative. Although aspects of previous projects are present here, his earlier characterizations, cities within, urban villages, worlds apart, fail to capture the Arcadian sense he ascribed on this secluded Malibu ridge. This becomes clear when one wanders the landscape into the valley below. Turning back to regard the house, one senses more clearly the uncanny delicacy of Israel's intervention. From this vantage point, fragmented red-orange surfaces pale in significance against their leafy surroundings. Trading the perils of permanence for the more fleeting pleasures of the provisional, the house presents not a single building, but a collection of cabins, maybe just a few tents, recently erected on a hillside clearing. Here, Israel's career comes full circle to fashion an architecture appropriate to this beautiful, duplicitous landscape. He drew on his most cherished childhood memories. Perched high above the Pacific, the Dan House reprises his beloved Camp Tahoney, a temporary haven to be treasured while it lasts and abandoned at the first sign of apocalypse. Thank you for listening. I will turn it over to Annie.
Thank you for having me, Todd and Knowlton School, and thank you for the really, really over-the-top introduction. I've never heard an introduction that's not just straight from a bio or something. So thank you also for that kind of insightful thing. So I'll start. What I wanted to share today is actually a journey between school, people you work for, and what happens after, which I think is more interesting for students who are in the audience. I work for 2 very slow offices and graduated from SciArc as an undergraduate. During the time, there's a lot of different thoughts going on. So I have taken studio from a conceptual artist, from a classicist, I learned the orders, from an urban planner, and from a protege of Frank Gehry's office. So that gave me this kind of eclectic California experience. You use the cursor and the thing better. So the slow part of it happened after undergraduate. I went to New York and I started working for Todd Williams and Billy Chan, and that's a very slow office. We chew on ideas and details for a very long time before we let it happen. And at Frank Gehry's office, I was in charge of doing iterative models. So Frank comes in, he has 10 ideas. Each 10 ideas get 10 iterations. And then he looks at it and he said, this one, this one, this one, 10 more of these. So with that kind of iterative process of model making, I think that's sort of where you were referring to. I do a lot of models back then, and really quick, dirty models. I went back to Columbia for my graduate work, and there I met a classmate who's a young faculty at University of Kentucky who sat next to me, and during the entire term, he only works on 1 model and 2 drawings. And it was on those 3 physical things that we all looked at Kurt Schwitter's Merzbau project. We were fascinated. This is 1923 to 1937. Schritter's built this in his Berlin studio just over time. And I was really fascinated by these continuous plastic forms. This is thesis model from Columbia. So you can begin to see I was asking questions, but I was only asking questions from the exterior relationship between landscape and architecture, and not so much understanding what's going on inside of it. And that's in contradiction to the interior experience that I have working for Billy and Todd. So it was a little bit kind of confusing for me how to get there. And so luckily, Ken Frampton gave me a chance to refer me to the SOM Traveling Foundation, and I got this fellowship, and I went to Central America, especially to Peru, because I was very interested in the Inca work. And there I found a little bit of an answer. So to your left, you have the Intihuatana, which is the hitching post of the sun, the most sacred place of the Machu Picchu. And you can see the response of the Incas towards that landscape. So that's what I was chasing after at Colombia, right? And then to the right, at Cuenco, which is part of the Cusco Valley, for the first time I said, there it is. Walls, floors, the space, all carved out from this other context, right? So this kind of negative process of thinking about, while I was in Frank Gehry's office, it was a bricolage just about assemblage, which is very much what MIT was doing to Stephen Shortridge around the same time we were in school. So in 1990, I went back with my husband and partner, Rick Gooding, back to Los Angeles at the depth of the recession. So he was working for Tom Main on competitions, and I got drafted into Frank's office to work on the large UCLA project, which is their first institutional project. And at the same time, I think then it began a sprint of about 5 years. So from these two slow offices, I came to an office where I'm just on the treadmill for 5 years, cranking out 12 projects. But it gave me a chance to really kind of almost like vomit out all the ideas that I've been thinking about, right? So you can sort of see these starting to formulate into projects such as the Hague House, which is the first time that I also figured out, oh, in plan, this would be a spiral, and how to get the two separate form language to work with each other. The UCLA Revlon Breast Care Center, which is a breast cancer clinic, also began to help me understand, okay, how do you get these different forms into different families working together? And so things start to click. And then when it came to the Draeger House, the rebuilt house in Berkeley, I kind of like gave it a little bit more steroid to try to see how these forms can contort and make into the interior space, and also have things address that kind of terrain the first time we get to work on the hillside as well. But at the same time, I was involved with some of my friends in a feminist reading group. So I'm kind of thinking about, here it is, Dr. Sharon Draeger, a vascular surgeon who went to work and then came back in no house anymore, came back to Frank Israel and said, I want a phoenix. And so I said, I need to look at what a woman's place in the house is and how I can actually honor her. And so these drawings were made in an attempt to make a diagram that talks about the space where she will be. So in this right-hand side photograph of the hallway, you're at the top of the hill inside the house, and you're looking down at the entrance. And when you look up at that little loft area, that's her office. And you're also looking out in this. She's in her private domain on the left-hand side. This is where the fireplace form came in from the outside, pressing in. To the left is her bedroom. To the left is her bedroom area, and the same piece of glass separate her office area, which you look out onto these windows, which look out onto the bridges of the East Bay. This is when I remember Frank's always saying to me, never design a window from the outside in, always from the inside out. So it very much, he is also in the vein of Todd and Billy's office, where interior as a kind of starting point is as important, and the material investigations are always very important and part and parcel of what it makes the interior and exterior. While Frank was still alive, about 1992 or so, we formed a partnership, Barbara Cowles, myself, and Frank, to go after a larger university project. This was 150,000 square feet as a fine arts building of 5 departments under one roof. And what the roof scheme was actually one of 3 trajectories that Frank asked me to investigate. He said, let's do a village, and then of course we do a wall scheme. Everyone does a wall scheme. And then how about a big roof scheme? And that intrigued me and also intrigued a lot of our clients who wanted 5 different art departments under the same roof, each with their own addresses, so to speak, but all united as one, what they call a spectacle. And they wanted to put UC Riverside Fine Arts on the map because they were the first PhD program in dance in the country. So that project went on the shelf after schematic design and after Frank passed away, and I started my office with Rick Gooding. Somewhere in the summer after he passed away, I came back to work with my former partners to realize the smaller version of the fine arts building. And it's the first time I was able to work with a campus scale landscape. So the ramp connects to the axial main space of the campus, and then this one roof idea, came into this project. And very much, I think, in nature you find a lot of continuous form. We have continuous form from our shoulder to our arms to our fingers, and I was always fascinated by how to do that. And so there was an attempt to try to make that happen. While I was working on models, Rick was working with me on the plan, which he's really good at solving all the puzzles because the program booklet came in this thick and we were trying to get all the spaces in here. And so this is the front view of the fine arts building, and it's responding to a dried arroyo next to it, and it's also responding to the Box Spring Mountains beyond. So you can kind of see the references. I think somewhere along the line I was reading maybe Stephen Hall's Anchoring or something, and talking about spaces in between buildings are in fact more important than the buildings themselves. And so the typology of the, that things that you found in nature, hiding under a rock, behind some rock cropping, going through tunnels and stuff like that. Some of those analogy came into these kind of public spaces. Even the color of the building was tagged to the Box Spring Mountains beyond, which you can see on the smoggiest day of the year. Because there's a saying out in that part of the larger LA area, don't trust the area you can't see. Anyway, so these are some of the typologies that we're interested in. Can these exterior form offer these kind of chutes and ladders, right, that you find in nature? In a very small way, through our own small work as an office, started in 1996, I continue to ask questions like, will any of these forms become, can I objectify it on the interior? Can they be used? What can you do to actually make a room? What is a room? Because at the same time, I was starting to be interested in this new discipline actually called interior architecture, where you use a lot of the architectural ideas, but you also address the needs of the interior to the point where you really need to know about interior design, decorative arts and everything that we always count on an interior design collaborators to work on. So in this particular one, I was trying to say, okay, can a room be made by an architectural space, an object, stair, this kind of array of these furniture as rug by crazy fiber artist Claudia Elstra from the Netherlands and stuff. So very, very sort of highly decorative work. At the same time, we were asked to imagine a public radio station, and it's in addition to a building that the Southern California Public Radio Station got. So again, there was a chance to look at these roof forms and the roof under the boxes. So as you can see, it's like not too many new ideas. It's sort of like one idea and keep asking more and more questions about it, to these exhibit opportunity where, what can this language do to the function of an office? Are these ramps, the places where people sit, and then tables, and then beds, all kind of in this one spiral. We do quite a bit of exhibition design for museums in LA and beyond. And so a very simple question, because it was a low budget thing, is what can the floor do for an exhibition that demands like 70 sets of prints being seen at the same time, a lot of reading? How do you index it? And so just using a similar color to the maple floor and basically folding a tab up to frame each of the grouping of the prints. Just kind of a very, very small idea. Or what can the wall do? It needs to kind of charge an area of part of an exhibition, so it comes down to the floor. And also, if you have the floor and the wall, can you make a space out of a space? Can you make a room out of it just by those simple gestures? And finally, this project got stopped because of the fire for the second time, because we got stopped for COVID and we got stopped again after the fire, trying to imagine a large interior space for the LA Convention Center addition renovation, and really sort of inverting the idea of these architecture, landscape, interior relationship, and putting them inside the sock and say, okay, now ceiling, wall, floor, what can we do? And at the same time saying, can I delaminate things that are, is there a graphic layer? Is it an architectural layer? Is it an opaque layer? Is it a sheer layer of skin? And starting to think about the kind of more advanced logic of that idea of continuity, but now through some kind of delamination. So, so that's sort of where the ideas that came with the collaboration with Frank really began to kind of move forward. So watch out for your thesis idea. They stick with you. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Annie. I think I wish a few more students were here, because I think that the kind of hints that you can trace through Annie's work, from before her time with Frank Israel, during her time with Frank Israel, after her time with Frank Israel, what you begin to see is the way someone can take a hunch that they had as a young kid that they hadn't probably thought all the way through, and turn it into a career. And I'm looking out at a kind of handful of colleagues, and some that I've known for decades, some that I've known for days, and I know that among you get some kind of idea sort of stuck in your craw. Like, I'm going to work on that for a while, whether it's a folded thing or whether it's a certain shape or a certain kind of relationship. And I think it's important to see how much mileage you can get out of a single idea, right? That you don't need a new idea every time. You actually, in many ways, it's better not to have a new idea, because you are developing something that you're already starting to get a handle on. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the way that your attitudes toward continuities and the sort of blurring of distinctions between elements came into, like, what were those early conversations with Frank like around those themes?
So first of all, Frank is a really good curator. The fact that he recruited both Stephen Shortridge, who came before me, and I referred to his MIT assemblage aesthetics, and then me coming from what Herbert Bouchon called, what are these hedgehog buildings that you've been doing? And these kind of continuous stuff that came from the ground. I think that he was intrigued by both approaches because they're quite different, really different. One is a bricolage, an assemblage, and one is always sort of hanging on to this thing and moving quite slowly. Like, I think Stephen's work moved quickly, and they're lighter, and they're really about sort of juxtaposed assemblage. And Frank didn't really acknowledge, but he said, there's something, and because he studied Kant, so he sees the possibility, which we haven't really been able to explore because he died too soon, the idea of those Scottish castle thick walls as part of those forms of continuity, or these carved forms, right, the negative spaces and stuff like that. So we were interested in that. When we did the Out of Order, his last exhibition at MoCA, I basically said, I crumbled a piece of paper and threw it into the model of the gallery and said, let's do this, right? And then, and he was really intrigued by the possibility now of like inhabiting that space, because we never had the chance to really build out those forms and actually in a real project and actually be able to do within it. It got to a point where we have to find like studio builders, like these Brits who have to drink a pint before they start work every day. They're the ones who can build all these angled walls and stuff, and I think he was intrigued by the experience of that.
I think that points to the kind of scenographic aspects of Frank's work. And I think it relates really closely to the idea of interior architecture that you were talking about.
Yeah.
That Frank's privileging of how things looked, which sounds kind of funny, but like how it looks rather than what it is, in many ways I think flies in the face of a lot of the historical folklore of modernism. Ken Frampton, for instance, wrote several books on the distinction that I know some of you students have heard me bang on and on about, the distinction between representational projects and ontological projects, right? The Kernform and the Kunstform and blah, blah, blah. And Frampton's argument was always the essence of the building is what matters, right? So tectonic honesty matters. The sort of nature of materials matters. And Israel's attitude seemed to be what it looks like matters, what it feels like matters. That if you need to make some behind the scenes adjustments to make this thing work, do it. And I bring this up not to say that one mode of working is right and one is wrong, but that it's easy for us to kind of fall into these habits, that there are sort of at least intuitive rules that kind of count. And what I find, what was really fun about working on this project for so many years was that Frank was kind of unbothered by the kind of puritanical attitudes that sometimes become sort of dominant in architecture. And I wonder if you could, kind of relate that, coupling up with the sort of superficiality that always is often pointed at Hollywood, or the superficiality that is pointed toward interior decoration, that architecture is serious and decoration is frivolous, and buildings are serious and movies are frivolous, that Frank seemed to turn that on his head in a really productive way. And what were those, again, like what were those conversations like?
I think we have to first acknowledge two really important people in his life, which you touch upon, which is Bob Stern, right? He is, had always had this relationship with Bob, and I relayed this little quip with Todd and some of our dinner guests last night, that Bob had said to me, he was one of my instructors at Columbia, I built a structural model which pleased Ken Frampton to no end, but then Bob told me, have you never heard of a transfer beam? You're just wasting your time. So I can see that kind of attitude, like get the imagery right, like don't worry about all the stuff that somehow got into Frank's brain, and he sees that as a set designer too. The idea about Hollywood, these kind of fleeting kind of imagery of spaces and stuff, and with his understanding that his life is going to be cut short, I think he was really very much interested, let's get this out. And so that's one thing. The other person who's really important to mention is Paul Fortune, who is a close friend of his, and you mentioned Paul, and club made and brilliant British-born interior designer, someone with a lot of understanding of color and how interior spaces create atmosphere and stuff. And I think their conversation makes Frank very much someone who appreciates how to make an interior. And so in a lot of these rooms and stuff that were created, I think he channels Paul, and I've seen him talk to Paul going over some projects and stuff, especially when it comes to the interior. Paul was working on the Limelight production projects with me at the end with all the colors and stuff like that. So I think that's sort of, maybe that answers your question about those influences.
Yeah, and Paul is a really important figure in this. He was kind of decorator to the stars for a long time. He ran these crazy nightclubs in Los Angeles in the 80s and 90s. And it reminds me that, I got to visit a lot of Frank's projects as I was doing this work, those that remain, which are mostly the houses. And what is really striking is how comfortable they are. You often go to, the houses that you're asked to learn by your teachers, and they will sometimes feel kind of cold, or they'll sometimes feel kind of oppressive in some way. And each of Frank's houses that I went to seemed like, I could totally live here. And I wouldn't feel like I was being pushed around by the house. If you go into a house by Frank Lloyd Wright, it's kind of telling you what to do all the time. When you go into a house by Frank Israel, it is accommodating you in a really interesting way, which again would seem like, well, isn't that what architects are supposed to do? But we don't a lot of the time. And that sense of accommodation, what I realized going through these houses, it has a lot to do with the finishes, it has a lot to do with the materials, and the clients totally get it. I went to Wes and Marla Strick's house. They did this fantastic new master suite for the Stricks. And we went in and we walked up into the bedroom, like the most intimate space in their house. And there's a big glass shower in the middle of the bedroom, and it opens onto a jacuzzi, which is on the terrace, which looks out over Hollywood. It's fantastic. And we walk into the space, and Marla says, you have to lay down in the bed right now. Like, get in the bed, because you have to see what I see when I wake up. So if you lied and you can't see it standing up, you have to lie down and see the way that this window frames this view, and it only works when you're lying on your back. And it's that's the design the window from the inside out. And you see those kind of moves again and again. And I guess to turn that into a question, I've been trying to figure out how to teach that for a very long time. How do you teach it?
Actually, I wanted to use that and launch into a couple of examples that become almost like phrases that we repeat in Frank's office. which is that a 29 or 30-inch table? Do you know what I'm talking about? Right? So that's the comfort level. A 29-inch table is a good dining table height. A 30-inch table is a good work desk height. That inch makes a difference. So we were, I think we were all interested, and Frank was promoting our greater understanding of how humans use space, the ergonomic aspect of it. But as much as he said, never design the window from the outside and always from the inside out. And we're always imagining, especially the bedroom, we always said, what do you see lying down? I mean, that's just kind of a thing that people were trained to think about for these spaces. So yeah, it's in there.
And you see it too in something that I find I'm often asking students. I'm looking at you guys, but what's the ceiling? When you're lying down, the ceiling becomes more important, right? And I see students who I've talked about the invisibility of the ceiling and pay attention to the ceiling. And when you look at the way that these kind of folds happen, like look at how much is going on in that ceiling, or look at the way that the colors are doing the work to define spaces that we might reflexively use walls to define those spaces. Or furniture is turning into something that's kind of wall, kind of furniture, kind of color. And that sort of, on one hand, it's inventiveness, but on the other hand, it's a kind of refusal to take the elements that we make the world out of for granted, right? That a chair is not just a chair, it's not a wall, it's not just a wall. And I mean, one of the real pleasures of working on this project was getting to root through all these drawings to see how carefully all this stuff got detailed, how many SKs were required to finish a project because it wasn't in the documents to begin with. But they were designing all the way up until after the houses were occupied in some cases. And it speaks to this commitment to making spaces, not making objects, but making spaces that you can kind of be in. And I don't know, I mean, somehow, for as much as I really love and am committed to architecture that's built around kind of abstract ideas, that the architecture kind of transports you to another sort of intellectual realm of thought through abstraction. There's something about the kind of physicality of these projects that makes you come back to them.
Well, when you think about the modernism and the strands of modernism, like the humanistic strands, you can say also Frank Gehry, Fountain, and Tom Billy, and I think Frank too, that there's a understanding of the human occupation of that space to the point where you're responsible for creating that space and not just focusing on floor and wall. Like you said, look at the ceiling. And, we shared this thing that I told my students, I don't trust the plan without dotted lines. Because you didn't think about that volume, you didn't think about the ceiling, and we never hardly in architecture school do a reflective ceiling plan, which all interior designers do. So I would say there's few things that you can force yourself to become a habit, which is I now start projects in section. That's where I start, because it's the first slice that talks about the building's relationship to land, to sky, and the promise of the interior within. So if you check yourself all the time and don't just make a rhino model cut and then leave it, but really investigate that slice. It has all the DNA, it has all your trajectory for how you want to posit your building, how you want light to come in, how people are to be, and they're both offices that I work for, Billy, Todd, and Frank. We never let a floor plan go out of the office without furnishing the whole thing. We just put furniture in it because there are always a time when people would make a room. You could put a bed in there, and you can't put a bed in there one way or two ways because you're, for it for bad feng shui and or just looking at closet and bathroom doors or something like that. Those are things that people who look at architecture as a service to humanity will care about. So I think it's a mixture. You know, I think that architecture is both art and service. And Frank's office, no matter what you think about it, actually takes the service part very seriously.
Yeah. No, I think that was something that came up last week with in one of the talks at SIRE. We were talking about architects having an adversarial relationship with their clients versus having a kind of a service orientation toward their clients. And Tom Main was sitting in the front row, and we were kind of bantering back and forth about the value of antagonism versus the value of accommodation. And I mean, I think sometimes it's a balancing act, but I would say, just as a reminder, never trust a plan without dotted lines. That's a good forearm tattoo. Keep that one in mind, Michael. I hope you wrote that down. And I know we've been talking for a while. Any questions from all of you? Yeah.
I really enjoyed a lot of things, but maybe my question is more about the vastness of slowness. You had mentioned about Frank Israel's work when you were in the office, and how Frank here would do lots of iterations and then choose one to do more iterations. I was wondering what the slowness of like in the office. What do you mean in the process?
The slowness? Well, I mean, you can't let go of that model and keep making models after models and trying to clarify ideas from that before you even try to draw it, right? That's probably one of the possibly slow processes. And in Billy and Todd's office, material almost come in the beginning, like in reading the site and the context and stuff. And the slow process comes from getting interested in the material, researching the material, and having worked with experiments with the material alongside the duration of developing the architecture. And it goes really slowly. Like there's still a sketching culture going on in that office as well as in my office too, because there's a lot of talking with the team and working on these ideas through sketches, through kind of material investigation. Sometimes we jump ahead. So instead of schematic design being just delivery of, let's say, a plan and elevations and stuff like that, in schematic design, you're already starting to think about the detail of certain materials. So it takes longer, right? Because you're dragging stuff in from the end process usually, but that's how these two offices a lot of times work, is that they don't work so linearly. They kind of work strategically. Sometimes if there's something that pulls from a higher level development, they bring it in and it sometimes inject a new clarity into the project. I mean, I can think of an example like Louis Kahn's Exeter Library, where the study carrel came in and the project sort of came into being. It didn't come in at the end. You can see some of the sketches and stuff that study carrel came along, and then suddenly there was the library. There was the idea of those thickened walls and stuff like that. So that's what I meant by slow. Fast is like you got an idea, get it out, build it, and you risk not having taken all the steps of furnishing the whole plan, seeing if the furniture will work within it, or really kind of studying things like we talk about the ideas of this lamination, that delamination stuff that came from the convention center was taking like many years to get to the point of saying, well, forms, surfaces, stuff, but what about the surface itself? Can the surface be investigated too? So that's what I meant by slow. like not letting go of an idea. I gave a title to this talk called "Digging One Hole." You know the story, the children's storybook Holes. Did you read that one? You can dig many holes, or you can dig one hole as deep as you can. So it seems to be I have worked for people who dig one hole really deep, and so yeah, that's how it worked.
You have a real premonition. Do you know that I worked for several years as a ditch digger?
Oh,
And I often say this is like you've never actually worked until you've dug a hole that's deeper than you are tall, which I have done many times.
which is against OSHA rules.
Yeah, I've had them fall in on me too. But I think that that's true, and it's a bit of the kind of hedgehog versus the fox, right? Hedgehogs dig one hole, and it's an oil well, and the fox kind of skitters around. And I think that maybe part of the tragedy of Frank's life is that he was in some ways, he had very hedgehog qualities, and he had some fox qualities as well, but at the end of the day, and I wonder if you would agree with this, I feel like he was in his heart a hedgehog who was forced by circumstance, really tragic circumstance, to operate like a fox. And I wonder what you make of that.
Yeah, it's interesting. Both Billy and Todd's office and Frank's office, the monograph that's always out is that big Louis Kahn linen covered book. That tells you something, right? So I do agree that he looked at the time that he had. He looked at the circumstances. He's totally fascinated by Hollywood, the whole machinery, the whole culture, and the kind of celebrity culture, and the cinegraphic nature of movies, being able to project these spaces that offer experiences, emotional experiences, and he knows that they're all important, right? And so that's really I think you tagged it quite right on the fox versus the hedgehog. If he had more time, I'm wondering what kind of work he would be doing 20 years later.
Any other comments or questions?
First of all, thank you for your presentation. I'm curious about this idea of interior architecture and kind of this more tight-knit relationship between space and human occupancy. I'm curious what you would say about where does the purview of architecture stop? Where is the edge of architecture, and where do other realms, environmental psychology, that sort of thing, kind of begin, or is there
I don't think there's a real distinct order. Interior architecture operates at a more intimate scale, sort of like as far as I can see or as far as I can feel in this building, doesn't go that far. Whereas architecture is a little bit more ambitious in terms of its scale, right? We address this whole building, the relationship to other buildings, to the trees beyond the ground plane, and things like that. So interior architecture to me is just a more sort of studied realm that is made by architecture, or that as somebody who practices interior architecture, they can push from the inside. Because when you think about how many times a building that was built get renovated in its lifetime, right? Many times. So I would call that act, right? Some kind of act that has the potential to do interior architecture. What would I do by coming here and seeing these two columns? Would I think of something in between? Maybe I find a very intimate space in between these columns for one body to be occupied, so that there's a contrast between these really large spaces and small spaces. Interior architecture also addresses, phenomenon that, we don't want to call it phenomenology, or we the old timers like us talk about phenomenology, which is not popular, but these kind of psychological freight that runs in our head that frames every experience we have. So interior architecture is that kind of discipline that encompasses all of that, all the human condition, the messiness of inhabitation and stuff, and try to make sense out of it. Where architecture, I don't want to think of architecture as core and shell, which is usually where people think about that separation. Yes, sometimes, but I think if you're an architect and you already think about occupation, like you test it with occupation technique, like furniture and stuff like that, then you're already blurring that boundary. So I'm for the blurring of that boundary.
That doesn't.
When you're starting a new project, what type of drawing do you think is the best for creating like an intimate experience of interiors? Like, would it be with models or would it be drawing plans or something else?
So, what do you recommend is the best starting point to produce an intimate interior? Like what sort of drawing or model is that what you suggest? Yeah.
Sometimes you have a little movie in your head when you're designing your project. So sometimes you just stop and sketch that out like a scene. Like if you have a scene in your head, put it down, and then go back and look at it. So if you have, I end up having a lot of sections in my head, so I put the section down. So it depends on where your tendency is. Everyone has different ones. I try not to. Sometimes I do concepts because I was drilled by one of my instructor in my last undergraduate thesis. He would not allow me to draw any plan or section until about 10 weeks in. And I was diagramming for 10 weeks. So some people work really well with diagrams. You can kind of keep working on the diagrams and clarifying and stuff. So I think everyone is quite different. But if you want to make a space, I tend to do a combination of a section, diagram to separate the different families that form that space, and then imagery that comes from somewhere. Sometimes it's just an atmosphere, sometimes it's just a particular detail, or like, dreaming in color, or whatever it is that you would do, just put it down. The families are really important to me. I mean, having that kind of roof, wall, floor way of talking about space. Now, families like, this is the concrete family that does X, Y, Z. The architectural metal and glass family does ABC, and this is a space of kind of simple 2 major families. That's it, right? There are more complicated ones, and so you look at the character of each of those families, and you say, what do you do? Are you trying to be looking strong, like the concrete one? I mean, you got the abstract drywall ones there. Well, that's the third family. So we don't know what it does, but like we kind of know what the steel and glass is doing. It's not weak. It's kind of semi-strong. So there is not much weakness, in the character. They think about them putting all the actors on stage. One is like the strong guy, and then there's somebody else, and you want to put all those people in a party that's going to work together. So those are some of the diagrams that I make sometimes. Like one-point perspective is very, very cool and very quick. If you can just, anyone can do a one-point perspective by sketch. You can just do that, and then you say, okay, here, this and this and this is one family. The other one, the background, and this wall and this floor is one family. So that's a quick way of getting you to force yourself to think about a kind of compositional logic that might work with your architectural logic of what is structured, what is non-structural.
Anybody else?
keep referring to Frank Israel as a hedgehog. And it seemed that the whole introduction to his work really was that he was no hedgehog at all. He was looking at everything. Whereas with Annie, I would say definitely a hedgehog. She goes to Machu Picchu, she sees the stone, and she says, that's it. That's all I need. And I just wondered, Annie, thinking of these two senses, because I think they're very different sensibilities. What was it like? And I can also imagine that at a certain point, as you describe him as a curator, he realizes, okay, I can get these two people in my office to do very different things.
Yeah.
But they're both things I'm really, really interested in. At this point in my life,
Yeah.
having worked through a lot of others, it seems to me a whole range of influences. He did not go to Machu Picchu with a stone and say, this is it. And so I wonder what your read on that is, given the trajectory of his career and that he seizes upon these two sensibilities that he's to guide his career.
Yeah, I think you got it right that, Frank looking at his life being, he knows it's going to be shortened. He likes both of those approaches. He was interested in both of those approaches. And actually the Jupiter House, which is done after Riverside, I believe, and Draker, he started hybridizing. The big thick roof of Jupiter House was not in the MIT language. And so he started to kind of question, can these be merged? And he didn't have enough time to kind of finish up that question.
Yeah, and there again, I do think that, he sure operated foxily.
Yes.
But the way that he would return to stuff, and the way, you would see the same kind of configurations return in different modes. Like things would start as a solid and then reappear as a void. And, he would get fixated, it seemed to me, on certain relationships. And I do think had he been able to slow down, he would have operated differently. And I wonder, if he had, the real tragedy of this is had Frank lived another 2 years, he'd still be here.
Yeah.
I never would have written this book. He'd still be banging away. And I suspect that he'd have slowed down. I think that the kind of frenetic nature of the experimentation, and just like I need to get this done, was again a kind of response to these horrible circumstances that he was faced with. That his friends were dropping like flies. His clients were dying midway through projects. The kind of specter of the AIDS epidemic is always in the background of this work, and the kind of, I think it's easy to mistake the intensity of production for frivolity, and I think that that's a mistake. I think there's definitely some frivolous stuff in there, for sure, but there's a kind of deeper quest. I think like he was really looking for. I've got 5 years. How do I construct a legacy? And architectural legacies don't get made in 5 years. It takes usually 50. And I don't know.
Well, you have to remember that he was really only in his 40s, right, when all this stuff was happening. He was mid-40s, going into late 40s, when I'm working with him. And he's still going to clubs, all leather chains and the whole gay scene in LA. And younger ones like us this is the rave stuff going on in LA then. So this office was, there's a bunch of us who would go to clubs in Crenshaw, which is the black neighborhood where the best house music is, and we finish with club and we come back into the office and start working. And and that whole scene of like having these celebrities. I mean, we have people coming by. The office is very strange. It's on the second floor of a little building called the Beverly Hills Playhouse. There's a 40-seat theater underneath it that was the place where Tennessee Williams' last Menagerie debuted, but it turned into an acting school. So we wade through these kind of self-conscious actors and actresses laying on the stair and we go up to work in 2 or 3 apartments that combine. So you open the door and the first thing you see is the bathroom. That's where the receptionist is, right? And then Frank is to the left. And I think that if we had given him, there was more time for him, I think he would have returned to 2 sources. I see it sort of coming because Khan was there all the time as like, okay, I'm out of everything. Let me go flip through Khan. There was something about that still continued to fascinate him, this kind of seriousness of this very grounded type of approach to architecture, but he was also interested in Charles Moore. So the campiness of things, and he's a club guy, he's not going to just be a serious architect, he's going to challenge you. Some of the furniture that he has around and the art he has around are like, tongue-in-cheek, strange things, like that's laying around. So I think he likes that kind of strangeness and that coming into, and I think that he would have investigated the kind of serious architectural language with these kind of really campy things that he also enjoys.
Yeah, and I don't know, I mean, we've been talking a while and we should probably wrap this up, but I think that in the end it's that funny oscillation, and it started in school between Louis Kahn and Bob Venturi, that he was kind of very highly influenced by both of them. And Venturi worked for Kahn, and there are a lot of similarities there, but there are also, the generational divide between the confidence with which Kahn could operate that Venturi could not afford. And then Frank could afford even less. That there was a kind of surety about Kahn's work that I think part of the reason to go back to it so often was that it was comforting. That like there's a guy who could make a decision and have it stick. And in a world where that kind of confidence was no longer available, I think that it speaks to the kind of tragedy that is in it. And so, I don't know, I will say that that's all the time we have. The book is Franklin D. Israel, A Life in Architecture. It's available from the Getty Research Institute, and I hope you will come to get a hold of a copy at some point, and I hope, Annie, you will come back and spend a little more time presenting your own work to the school, because I think it would be a really worthwhile invite to make. So
Thank you.
let's make that happen soon.